The first time I understood that my father's God and my heart could not exist in the same room, I was 17 years old, sitting in the third pew from the front of Calvary Hope Baptist Church in Memphis, Tennessee, wearing a white dress my mother had pressed the night before and white patent leather shoes that pinched my toes, and I was holding Sister Diane Crawford's hand during the closing hymn, not because the Spirit had moved me, but because Diane Crawford was the most beautiful person I had ever seen in my life, and holding her hand felt like touching something I was not supposed to touch, and I knew even then that knowing that would cost me everything. My father was Reverend Marcus Elijah Tatum. He was not simply a pastor. He was the kind of man a whole community built their faith around. 6'2", broad-shouldered, with a voice that could drop into a register so low you felt it in your chest before you heard it with your ears. He had founded Calvary Hope himself in 1987, renting out a converted auto body shop on Lamar Avenue with 14 folding chairs and a borrowed keyboard, and by the time I was born in 1991, the congregation had grown to over 800 members. By the time I was a teenager, we had a brick building with stained glass windows, a full choir, a television broadcast on Sunday mornings, and my father's face on a billboard on Elvis Presley Boulevard that read, "Where the Lost Are Found, Calvary Hope Baptist Church, Rev. Marcus E. Tatum." I grew up inside that church the way other children grow up inside their houses. It was where I learned to walk, learned to sing, learned what it meant to be watched. My mother, Deaconess Evelyn Tatum, was just as central to that world as my father. She ran the women's ministry, organized every fundraiser, knew every family's business, and carried herself with the kind of dignified grace that made people straighten their posture when she walked into a room. My older brother, Marcus Jr., played drums in the praise band. My younger sister, Kendra, sang in the children's choir. We were the first family of Calvary Hope Baptist Church, and that meant we were always on display. What that meant, practically, was that I had never had a private moment in my life. Every feeling I had, every expression that crossed my face, every friendship I formed or failed to form, was subject to interpretation by a congregation of people who believed my family was called by God and therefore held to a higher standard. I learned early to keep my face still. I learned to smile at the right moments and to look moved during the sermons even when I was somewhere else entirely inside my head. I learned to perform composure the way other girls my age were learning to perform confidence or coolness. I was good at it. My mother said I had natural grace. What I had was practice. Diane Crawford joined our congregation when I was 16. Her family had moved from Atlanta after her father took a job at FedEx. They were the kind of family that fit immediately. Her parents were church-going people. Her father had an easy laugh. Her mother made the best sweet potato pie anyone at Calvary Hope had ever tasted. And Diane herself was quiet and serious and sang alto in a way that made the whole second row go still. She was 17, a year ahead of me, and she wore her natural hair in a puff that my mother privately called a little informal for Sunday service, and that I thought was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. We became friends the way girls do at that age, slowly at first, and then all at once. We were paired together for a women's ministry event in the fall, assigned to set up tables and fold napkins into fans, and we talked the whole afternoon about things that had nothing to do with church. She was funny in a dry, understated way that surprised me. She read the same books I read. She had opinions about things. She was not performing anything, not for me, not even a little, and being around someone like that after a lifetime of performance felt like taking off shoes that had been too tight for years. By winter we were inseparable. She came over on Saturday afternoons to study. We sat in my room with our textbooks open and mostly talked. My mother approved of the friendship, which meant it was safe, which meant I could have it without guilt, which I was grateful for even as I began to understand that something about what I felt for Diane was not what my mother thought she was approving. I did not have a name for it at first, or rather I had a name for it, but the name belonged to a category of person that Calvary Hope Baptist Church had very specific opinions about, and I was not willing to apply that name to myself. I told myself it was admiration. I told myself it was the particular closeness that develops between girls who become best friends. I told myself a great many things over the course of that first year, and I almost believed some of them. What I could not explain away was the way my chest tightened when she walked into a room, the way I memorized the exact sound of her laugh, the way I lay awake some nights replaying conversations with her in my head, turning them over and over, looking for something I could not name. The way that Sunday in January when I held her hand during the hymn, the whole world went quiet except for the warmth of her palm against mine, and I thought, this is what people mean when they say they feel the presence of God, and immediately understood that I had just committed some kind of profound and irreversible blasphemy. I was 17, I was the Reverend's daughter, and I was in love with my best friend. I carried it for 2 years before I told anyone. Those 2 years were the strangest of my life. Outwardly completely normal, inwardly completely not. I went to school, came home, went to church, sang in the choir, helped my mother plan events, got good grades, applied to colleges. I did everything I was supposed to do. And underneath all of it, I was living a second life that existed only inside my own head, a life where I let myself feel what I actually felt, where I did not immediately extinguish every flicker of emotion that arose in me when I looked at Diane. Because Diane was still there, we were still best friends. She went to Spelman, I went to the University of Memphis so I could live at home and save money, and even the distance of an Atlanta campus could not loosen what existed between us. She came home for every holiday. We talked on the phone for hours. We visited each other. And the whole time, what I felt for her continued to grow in the way that things grow when you try to starve them. Not smaller, but stranger and more insistent, mutating into something I could no longer pretend was simple friendship. The first time I let myself say the truth out loud, I was alone in my car, parked outside the Kroger on Poplar, and I had just gotten off the phone with her, and she had said something that made me laugh so hard I cried, and when I caught my breath I said to no one, to the steering wheel, to the Memphis night, I love her. And then, after a pause, I am gay. It did not feel like liberation. I want to be honest about that. People talk about coming out to yourself as though it is a door swinging open, light flooding in. What it felt like for me was more like finally looking at an injury you had been walking around on for years. The relief of acknowledgement followed immediately by the full force of the pain, because I knew, the moment I said those words in that car, exactly what they meant for every single aspect of my life. I knew what they meant for my family. I knew what they meant for my church. I knew what they meant for the way my father had raised me to understand God and sin and redemption. I knew what they meant for Diane, who had never said anything to me, not one word, not one look, that gave me any reason to believe she felt what I felt. I drove home and went to bed and did not tell anyone. The person I eventually told was my cousin Renata, who lived in Nashville and had attended Calvary Hope exactly once in her life, and had spent the entire service making barely concealed faces at the call and response portions, which had always made me love her. Renata was 26, worked in graphic design, and had an apartment with a pride flag in the window of her building that she had put there specifically, I later learned, so that anyone in our family who needed a signal would have one. I drove to Nashville on a Saturday in October of my junior year and sat at her kitchen table and told her everything. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she got up, poured us both something to drink, sat back down, looked me in the eye and said, "Okay, so, what do you need from me right now?" That was all. That was the entirety of her response, and it is to this day. The most perfect thing anyone has ever said to me in a moment of vulnerability, because it asked nothing of me except to know what I needed, which meant that whatever I needed was available, which meant I was not alone. What I needed, it turned out, was to cry for about 40 minutes, eat her leftovers, watch terrible television, and sleep on her couch. She provided all of these things without comment. I drove back to Memphis the next morning feeling, for the first time in years, like a person who existed rather than just a performance of a person. I did not tell anyone else for another 18 months. By the time I was 21, I had developed what I can only describe as a double life, though that phrase makes it sound more dramatic and intentional than it was. The truth was more mundane. At home and at church, I was exactly who I had always been: present, responsible, composed, the Reverend's eldest daughter. Outside of that world, slowly, tentatively, I had begun to exist in other ways. I had friends from school who knew the truth about me. I had been to a few bars in the Overton Square area, had gone with a group of girls from my sociology class, had stood in those spaces, and felt the particular disorientation of being somewhere you belong before you even know you belong there. I had not told Diane. Our friendship had continued, deepened even, through college. She graduated from Spelman and came back to Memphis to work at a nonprofit focused on youth literacy. We saw each other constantly. She was still my closest person. And I had accepted, somewhere in the process of living my life, that what I felt for her was something I would carry and not act on, because our friendship was more important than my feelings, and because I could not predict what disclosure would do to the most important relationship I had. This calculation, carefully maintained for years, blew apart on a Tuesday night in March. We were at her apartment, which she shared with a roommate who was out of town. We had been watching a movie, and the movie had gotten to a scene that neither of us had anticipated: two women, quietly, tenderly kissing, and I had felt my whole body go still in the way it always did, and I had not looked at Diane, and Diane had not looked at me, and then the scene had passed and we had kept watching. And when the movie ended, we sat in a silence that felt different from our normal silences, charged with something unnamed. Diane turned to me. She said, "Can I tell you something?" I said yes. She said, "I've been trying to figure out how to say this for about 3 years, so I'm just going to say it and then you can respond however you want." She paused. She looked at her hands. "I'm in love with you. I have been for a long time. And I understand completely if that changes things between us, but I had to say it because I can't keep not saying it." The silence afterward lasted about 4 seconds. I said, "I have been in love with you since the winter you moved here, since the day we folded napkins in the fellowship hall. What followed that exchange is mine to keep. But I will say that when I drove home at 2 in the morning, Memphis quiet around me, the city glittering and indifferent through my windshield, I cried the entire way not from sadness, but from the sheer overwhelming weight of having been, for the first time in my life, completely known by another person and not lost in the knowing. We were careful, that is the word I would use, careful. We understood without discussing it that our situation required a particular kind of navigation. Diane's family attended Calvary Hope. My father was the pastor. The community we both lived inside was tight, observant, and held very specific beliefs about what we were to each other and what we were allowed to be. We were not naive about any of this. We loved each other with full awareness of the cost, which is maybe the only kind of love that is truly serious. We did not hide exactly. Hiding implies active deception, and we were not lying to anyone. We were simply not announcing something that was not the world's business. We continued to be best friends, publicly, visibly. We continued to attend church together, sit together in the choir loft, go to Sunday dinners at my parents' house. My mother adored Diane. My father thought of her as a second daughter. My sister Kendra, who was 17 by then, sometimes joked that Diane was the sister she actually wanted, which made us both laugh for reasons Kendra didn't know. This went on for 2 years. And then, on a Sunday morning in September, everything changed. I want to describe that Sunday the way it actually was, which means I have to describe it slowly, the way it happened, because it did not happen all at once. I knew something was wrong when I arrived at church and my father was not in the lobby. He always stood in the lobby before service. It was one of his habits, unchangeable as weather. He greeted people at the door, shook hands, hugged the older women, knelt down to talk to the children at their eye level. The lobby without my father in it was immediately strange, like a stage set with a missing piece. My mother was already in the sanctuary, seated in the family row. When I sat beside her, I noticed she looked as she looked when she had been crying and had applied her makeup afterward, eyes slightly swollen, expression precise and controlled in the way that takes effort. I touched her hand. She squeezed mine and said nothing. I looked at her, she looked at the pulpit. The choir opened service. I sang on autopilot. My mind was working underneath the music, turning over what I had noticed, trying to construct an explanation that made sense. My father had been quieter than usual the past few weeks. I had attributed it to the pressures of church leadership, which were real and constant. Now I was less sure. He came out for his sermon 20 minutes into the service. He was wearing his best robe, the black and gold one, the one he wore on high occasions. He greeted the congregation with his usual authority, and the congregation responded with their usual warmth, and for about 5 minutes everything looked and sounded like every other Sunday of my life. And then he said, "I want to speak this morning about the ways the enemy comes for our families. Not from outside, from within." I felt something shift in my chest, a premonitory tightening. He talked about deception. He talked about wolves in sheep's clothing. He talked about the particular danger of sin that presents itself as love. He talked about Sodom and Gomorrah with a specificity and intensity I had not heard from him in years, not since the early days of the church, when his preaching style had been harsher and less tempered by years of pastoral experience. He was not reading from notes. He was speaking from somewhere urgent and private. And then he said, "I received information this week that broke my heart as a father, and I am not going to stand in this pulpit and pretend I did not receive it, because this is a church, not a country club, and in this church we tell the truth." The congregation was very still. This was not a normal sermon. Everyone could feel it. He did not say my name. I need to be clear about that. He did not say my name or Diane's name. He said a young woman in this community. He said someone raised in the faith. He said a deception that has gone on too long. He said these things in his preaching voice, which was not the same as his speaking voice, which meant it went out to 800 people and to the television cameras and to everyone watching the broadcast and to the live stream. And he said them while I sat in the third pew from the front in my church clothes and understood with complete and terrible clarity that he was talking about me. I do not know what my face did. I became very aware of my face and very uncertain of what it was doing, which had never happened to me before in that building. I had spent my entire life knowing what my face was doing. I sat very still. I held my hands in my lap. I looked at the pulpit and not at the people around me, and not at my mother and not at Diane, who was in the choir loft. who I could feel without looking at, who I knew was sitting very still in the same way I was sitting very still. He preached for 40 minutes. He preached about repentance and restoration, and the mercy of God available to those who turned away from the sin he did not name, but named precisely enough. He preached with a grief that was real. I could hear it, underneath the authority of the voice, the actual grief of a man who believed everything he was saying and was saying it because he thought he had to. When the service ended, I did not move immediately. People around me moved. Someone touched my shoulder, said something I didn't process. I became aware that my mother was still seated beside me. That she had not moved either, that we were the last 2 people in the family row. She said quietly, without looking at me, "Your father wants to speak with you, in his office." I said, "Okay." She said, "Kezia." She said my name the way she said it when I was very small and had done something she needed me to understand the seriousness of. "I need you to hear me." I looked at her. "I love you," she said. "Whatever happens in that office, I need you to know that first." What happened in that office was not what I expected. I had expected anger. My father was capable of enormous anger, the kind that felt like weather, like something you moved through and hoped to survive. I had braced for that. What I got instead was sorrow, which was harder. He was sitting behind his desk when I came in. He looked older than he had looked on the pulpit. The robe was off. He was in his suit, and the suit made him look like a man rather than a pastor, and somehow that was more difficult to face. He said, "Sit down, Kezia." I sat. He looked at me for a long time. He said, "I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth." I said, "I will." He said, "Are you?" He stopped. He looked at his hands. He started again. "Is what I was told about you true?" I said, "That depends on what you were told." He told me, someone I never found out who, whether it was someone who had seen something or someone who had been told something that had traveled some path I could not trace, had told my father that his daughter was in a relationship with another woman. That was the word used, relationship. They had told him it had been going on for some time. They had told him the other woman was someone he knew. When he finished, I sat for a moment, then I said, "Yes, it's true." The silence that followed that was the longest silence of my life. He said, "How long?" I said, "We've been together for 2 years, but I've known who I am for much longer than that." He looked at me. His eyes were full in a way I had seen maybe twice before, at his mother's funeral, and once when Marcus Jr. had been in a car accident that we thought, for about 4 hours, might kill him. He was not a man who cried easily, and he was not crying now, but he was on the edge of something. He said, "You are my firstborn child." I said, "I know." He said, "I don't know how to hold this." I said, "I know." We sat there in his office, in the quiet of the church that had emptied out around us, and for a long time neither of us said anything more. Outside the window, the parking lot was clearing. The Sunday morning Memphis sky was the particular shade of grey that comes before rain. I said, "Daddy, I am the same person you raised. I have not changed. I am not different from who I have always been. I am also this." He said, "The word says." I said, "I know what the word says. I have read it my whole life, and I have also spent my whole life in this church watching you love people who the word says things about. I have watched you visit men dying of AIDS and hold their hands. I have watched you marry people on their 2nd and 3rd marriages. I have watched you preach mercy more than you have preached anything else. I am asking you to extend that mercy one more time." He did not respond immediately. He looked at the desk. He picked up a pen and set it down. He said, "I need time." I said, "Okay." I stood up. I moved toward the door. Then I stopped, because there was something else I had to say, something I had not planned to say, but that rose up in me with a certainty that felt almost external. I turned around. I said, "I want you to know that she loves me, and I love her. And if that is a sin, then I have to stand before God with that. But I will not stand before God having lied about who I am. You taught me that. You taught me that God doesn't want our performance. He wants our truth." I left the office and went home. The weeks that followed were some of the hardest I have ever lived. My father did not call. My mother called every day. She never told me what to do or how to feel. She called and asked how I was and listened and sometimes said very little. Once she cried on the phone quietly, and when I asked her what she was crying about, she said, "I'm crying because you have had to carry this alone for so long, and I didn't know, and I should have known." I did not know what to say to that. I said, "You couldn't have known." She said, "Maybe, maybe not." Deanne's family found out, as these things tend to find out, through the church network. Her mother called her. The conversation was long and painful. Her father did not call. That absence said what he could not say. Diane told me about it on the phone, very quietly, in a voice that did not waver, but that I knew was costing her something. Kendra called me. She called me the week after the sermon and she said, "I just want you to know that I don't care. I mean, I care about you, but I don't care about the other thing. You're my sister. That's the only thing that matters to me." She said it in the quick, slightly impatient way she said most things, as though stating the obvious, and it broke something open in me. Marcus Jr. did not call. I did not expect him to. He and my father had always been closely aligned in their thinking, and I understood that his silence was not cruelty but conflict, that he was working something out that would take more time than the world was going to give him. I was right about that. It took him 2 years, but he got there. Calvary Hope continued. My father preached his sermons. The congregation continued to grow. I stopped attending for a while, not because I was forced to leave, but because I could not sit in those pews and be looked at in the way I was now being looked at, with the mixture of pity and judgment and curiosity that I recognized from watching it applied to other people and was not prepared to have applied to me. I found a smaller church on the other side of the city, a progressive congregation with an openly gay associate pastor and a choir that sang the same songs I had grown up with, and I sat in the back row my first Sunday there and cried through the whole service because the music was the same, and the building was different, and somehow that combination undid me. My father and I did not speak for 4 months. Then in January he called. He called on a Wednesday night, which had always been Bible study night at Calvary Hope. I knew he was calling from his office, probably between the first and second sessions, because I knew his schedule the way you know the schedules of people who have organized your whole life. He called and I answered and he said, "Kezia, I've been doing a lot of reading and a lot of praying and a lot of thinking." I said, "Okay." He said, "I don't have all the answers. I want you to know that I am not standing here with all the answers." He paused. "I am standing here as your father, and I have decided that being your father has to come before everything else, before what I believe, before what I have preached, before what the congregation thinks, because I cannot." His voice broke briefly. He steadied it. "I cannot lose you. I cannot lose my child." I was quiet for a long moment. I said, "Daddy." He said, "I am not there yet. I need you to know that. Theologically, I am still working through it, but personally, as your father, I am not willing to choose doctrine over my daughter." I said, "That's enough, that's more than enough, we can work on the rest." He said, "I would like to meet Diane, properly, not as I would like to meet her as the person you love." I did not trust my voice for a moment. I said, "I'll ask her." He said, "Okay," a pause. "Are you eating? You sound thin." I laughed. I could not help it. I said, "You can't sound thin." He said, "You sound like you haven't been eating." I said, "I'm eating." He said, "Your mother is going to start sending food over." I said, "Tell her I'd like that." The dinner happened in March. My mother made her full Sunday spread on a Saturday, fried chicken and greens and macaroni and her cornbread that no one had ever successfully replicated, and Diane and I drove over together and stood on the porch of the house I had grown up in, and Diane straightened my collar and I straightened hers, and we looked at each other for a moment. She said, "We're going in there either way." I said, "We are." She said, "Whatever happens." I said, "Whatever happens." We went in. My father was sitting in the living room. He stood when we came in, the way he stood when anyone came into his home, out of an ingrained courtesy that was stronger than anything else in him. He looked at Diane. She looked at him. Something passed between them that I am not qualified to describe because it belonged to them, not to me. He extended his hand. He said, "Diane, welcome." She took his hand. She said, "Thank you for having me, Reverend Tatum." He said, "Marcus." She said, "Thank you for having me, Marcus." He nodded. He said, "Come on in, your mother put food on." He was talking to me, but his eyes moved between us, and there was something in them that I recognized from years of watching him at the door of his church, the particular look he had when someone came in who he had not expected and who had arrived. He was realizing exactly when they were supposed to. Dinner was not easy. I am not going to pretend it was easy. There were long silences. There were moments when my father looked at his plate in a way that meant he was thinking hard about something he was not yet ready to say. There were moments when my mother talked too quickly to fill space, which was unlike her, and which meant she was nervous, which I had almost never seen. But there was also this: the food was incredible, as my mother's food always was. Diane asked my father about the church's early years, and he lit up the way he always lit up when asked about Calvary Hope in the beginning, and talked for 20 minutes about the folding chairs and the borrowed keyboard, and the 14 people who had believed in something that didn't exist yet. And Diane listened the way she listened to everything, completely, with her whole self, and I watched my father notice her listening, and I watched something in him shift. After dinner, while my mother and I were in the kitchen, I heard my father say something to Diane in a low voice. I couldn't hear the words. I heard her response, "I know, and I love her the same way." I did not ask either of them what was said. Some things are not mine to know. The years since that dinner have not been simple. I want to be honest about that too, because the version of this story that ends with one dinner and a healed family is not the story that actually happened. My father and I have had hard conversations. He has said things that hurt me. I have said things that I regret. There have been Sundays when he has preached things that I could not sit in a pew and hear, and have come home and called him, and we have argued, really argued, the way we never argued when I was growing up, and those arguments have been painful for both of us. He has not publicly changed his position. He has not put a pride flag in the window of Calvary Hope Baptist Church. He is still, theologically, working through things that may take the rest of his life. But he has also done this. He performed the commitment ceremony when Diane and I got married, 5 years after that Sunday sermon. He did it in my mother's backyard on a June evening with 50 people present. He wore his collar and he read scripture and he said words that joined us together in front of everyone we loved. And when it was over, he hugged us both and his eyes were wet and he said, very quietly, so only we could hear, "I believe God brought you to each other." I am still working out what I believe about everything else, but I believe that. My mother cried openly and without apology from the beginning to the end of the ceremony. Kendra was my person of honor. Marcus Jr. came, brought his wife and kids, stood in the back row and shook Diane's hand at the end and said, "Welcome to the family. Sorry it took me so long." Diane's mother came, her father did not. That absence was noted and grieved and then set aside, because we have learned, Diane and I, that you cannot make people arrive before they are ready, and that in the meantime you have to live your life. We live in Midtown Memphis now. We have a house 2 blocks from a coffee shop and 3 blocks from a park where we walk on Sunday mornings when we go to our church, the small progressive one where I have been a member for 7 years now, and sometimes we still go to Calvary Hope for special occasions, for my father's anniversary service, for Easter, for the Christmas cantata that my mother directs every year, and when we walk in my father greets us at the door the way he greets everyone, with his hand extended. His voice warm, his eyes landing on us with an expression that is complicated and human and unresolved and full of love. The billboard on Elvis Presley Boulevard is still there, where the lost are found. I drive past it sometimes. I do not feel lost. I have not felt lost since that Tuesday night in Diane's apartment when she said, "Can I tell you something?" and I said yes, and everything that had been held separately inside me came together into something whole. My father is still working things out. So am I, so is everyone in this story. That is the most honest thing I can say about faith and family and love, that they do not resolve cleanly, that they live in the unfinished middle, that you do not get a before and after so much as you get a continuous present in which people are always becoming, always arriving, always not quite there yet, and somehow, impossibly, already here. Diane is in the kitchen right now. I can hear her. She is making coffee and playing something on her phone. She always plays music when she cooks, always has. It was one of the first things I knew about her. The coffee smell is coming under the door of the room where I am writing this. Memphis is outside the window, the same city it has always been, the same light, the same complicated sky. My father called yesterday. He wanted to know if we were coming to Sunday service this week. I said I didn't know yet. He said, "Your mother made your favorite. She's sending it over either way." I said, "Tell her thank you." He said, "She already knows. She just likes to be told." And I sat with the phone in my hand for a moment after we hung up, listening to the city, listening to the music from the kitchen, and I thought, this is what I would have lost if I had kept hiding. This ordinary, imperfect, irreplaceable life. I do not think God made a mistake when God made me. I stopped believing that somewhere between the folding napkins and the Tuesday night, and the Sunday sermon and the March dinner, and the June evening in my mother's backyard, and the 7 years of Sunday mornings that have followed, I stopped believing I was a mistake, and I started believing I was exactly what I was supposed to be. My father is still working out what he believes about that. But he picks up the phone when I call. Every time, without fail, he picks up the phone. That is where we are, that is what we have built, that is for now enough.